Welcome back to our penultimate, second to last session of our study of 1 Samuel. In the final session, we will wrap some things up and talk about some of the important things that we've learned and where to go from here. But there's one more story that we need to take a look at, and I have bad news. It's not as happy of a story as Abigail. In some ways, I think in the narrative, this character that we're going to be examining today and the interactions between her and the other primary character, Saul, are something of a contrast to what we see when we look at David and Abigail. I'm talking about Saul and the witch of Endor, and it's in 1 Samuel chapter 28. I'd like to go ahead and once more read the text. It's one of those texts that, like many of these, you might be aware that there's a story somewhere in the Bible about this weird seance, but having actually read the story is different than being aware of its general existence. And so let's see if we can't look at some of the details here and then unpack some of what we see. Beginning, actually, this one is kind of weird. It begins in verse 3 of chapter 28, so we'll pick it up right there. It says, Now Samuel was dead. That's exactly how the last story started. And all Israel had mourned for him and buried him in his own town of Ramah. Samuel had expelled the mediums and spiritists from the land. So we're getting the setting here. Samuel's gone, and all of those diviners and spiritists and witches is the general term that we would use, mediums and such, are gone. Verse 4, the Philistines assembled and came and set up camp at Shunem, while Saul gathered all Israel and set up camp at Gilboa. And so the issue here is the real threat. I won't keep interrupting after every verse, by the way. I'll just set the context for us. It's a real threat here because it's actually kind of like there's a similarity to the scene when David met Goliath. The Philistines were creeping up into the northern portion of Israel's territory, and it seemed that their goal was essentially to cut the line and to separate the northern portion of the kingdom from the southern portion of the kingdom so that they might have a strategic advantage over Israel. And so once more, it's very similar to the situation that arose whenever David fought Goliath. And yet, unfortunately, by this point in the narrative, we have descended far from that day. Young David is nowhere to be found, at least not among Israel's troops, and Saul is the reason why. So let's pick back up and see what takes place. Verse 5. When Saul saw the Philistine army, he was afraid. Terror filled his heart. He inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him by dreams or Urim or prophets. Saul then said to his attendants, Find me a woman who is a medium, so that I may go and inquire of her. There is one in Endor, they said. So Saul disguised himself, putting on other clothes, and at night he and 2 men went to the woman. Consult a spirit for me, he said, and bring up for me the one I name. But the woman said to him, Surely you know what Saul has done. He has cut off the mediums and spiritists from the land. Why have you set a trap for my life to bring about my death? But Saul swore to her, By the Lord, by Yahweh. As surely as Yahweh lives, you will not be punished for this. And then the woman asked, Whom shall I bring up for you? Bring up Samuel, he said. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out at the top of her voice and said to Saul, Why have you deceived me? You are Saul. The king said to her, Don't be afraid. What do you see? And the woman said, I see a ghostly figure coming up out of the earth. What does he look like? He asked. An old man wearing a robe is coming up, she said. And then Saul knew it was Samuel, and he bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. Samuel said to Saul, Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? I'm in great distress, Saul said. The Philistines are fighting against me, and God has departed from me. He no longer answers me, either by prophets or by dreams, so I've called on you to tell me what to do. Samuel said, Why do you consult me now that the Lord has departed from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done what he predicted through me. The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hands and given it to one of your neighbors, to David. Because you did not obey the Lord or carry out his fierce wrath against the Amalekites, the Lord has done this to you today. The Lord will deliver both Israel and you into the hands of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will also give the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines. Immediately Saul fell full length on the ground, filled with fear because of Samuel's words. His strength was gone, for he had eaten nothing all that day and all that night. But when the woman came to Saul and saw that he was greatly shaken, she said, Look, your servant has obeyed you. I took my life in my hands and did what you told me to do. Now please listen to your servant and let me give you some food so you may eat and have the strength to go on your way. He refused and said, I will not eat. But his men joined the woman in urging him, and he listened to them. He got up from the ground and sat on the couch. The woman had a fattened calf at the house, which she butchered at once. She took some flour, kneaded it, and baked bread without leaven. Then she set it before Saul and his men, and they ate. That same night they got up and left. As always, in this terrible end to Saul's life, as we approach the actual end, he appears interested in hearing the word of the Lord, and emphasis here on the word appears. But by this point, the normal channels have run dry, like all of the ways in which the king might hear from God have been removed. So Saul, for his part, killed the priests of Ahimelech. We remember that from the past, and Samuel himself has died. Once again, the narrator notes that for us. It's an important detail for understanding what's going on here. Although it's not like Saul actually listened to Samuel when he was alive, but nonetheless, that's who he's looking for. And so there's these new ways that he's trying to seek the will of the Lord, maybe by Urim, maybe by dreams. Dreams seem to have been a way that God often spoke to kings. You think about Nebuchadnezzar and others, and yet God is not speaking. And so once again, we see that Saul's devotion to Yahweh is really pretty shallow. He actually reverses one of the few righteous decrees we learn about that he's made. And we only learn about this righteous act that Saul had done in removing the mediums and spiritists from the land. We only learn about this in the breaking of it. And so we see here that he had done a good thing, but now, having outlawed divination and necromancy and these various things, he seeks one of the very witches, one of the very mediums that he had sent away. And so we see this turn to magic, and it's not so much a reversal of it's not only a reversal of his previous political policy, but essentially it's an outright acceptance of paganism. I mean, we have fallen far, far from where we began. Israel, we remember, wanted a king like the kings of the other nations, and that is quite unfortunately precisely what she got. And so there's lots going on here. Let's note that the general picture of Saul's depravity is really reinforced by some of the details in the story. We've noticed that the narrator of 1 Samuel doesn't just tell us facts because they're facts. He tells us facts because they're interesting for the point being made. There's a little bit of a pun on the idea of asking. You may remember that Samuel was named Samuel because Hannah was given what she asked. And it was kind of a strange thing because the name Samuel doesn't really mean asked. It kind of means more like heard. But the name Saul is very closely related to the word for asking. And so Hannah asked for Samuel and received him, and Israel asked for a king like the other nations, and what they got is Saul. And here the asked for one, Saul, is asking the wrong person from the wrong place for guidance. She dwells at the sort of intersection between earth and the place of the dead, or Sheol. Sheol, Saul, also similar to this word for ask. And so you have this pun about asking in the wrong directions. You also have to notice that Saul has to disguise himself for this. And so we're told that he puts on some other clothes other than the ones he normally wears. So he literally is divesting himself of his royal robes in this action. He probably doesn't understand the significance of this, but he's showing the significance of what's taking place. He is demonstrating one more time of his unfitness to be the king of Israel. And he not only promises this woman protection, but he does so in the very name of Yahweh, the God whom he's in the process of disobeying. He claims his name as proof that this woman will be okay. We learn, again, that the name means nothing to him except for a way to get what he wants. And then, of course, by the end of the story, Saul is eating at the table of demons. And there's even a possibility, one of my friends who teaches the Old Testament would suggest that what's going on here may be that she's actually offering a sacrificial meal to these false gods. And there's a possibility that he's quite literally eating at the table of demons. And I also wonder if there isn't some sort of a faux Passover thing going on here. We have the specific mention of the unleavened bread, and so perhaps this is designed for us to recall the previous story, only the characters are all messed up. Like, the king of Israel is not so much the one who's being delivered from bondage. He seems to be in the role of Pharaoh. This firstborn king of Israel will soon die, and this will actually mean that God's people can be free to worship him appropriately. And so there's all sorts of ironies here that demonstrate, again, just how far Saul has fallen, for he will indeed die the very next day, making his own exodus from the account. And finally, you maybe notice that there's this emphasis on fear. So Saul is afraid, and then he is terrified, and then she is afraid, and he says, don't be afraid. And there's just this ongoing fear that seems to be taking place and really increasing as the story unfolds. And we note that having long since feared the Lord, Saul now finds himself kind of fearing anything he can find. And so he's just a panicky type of person because he's removed himself from God's guidance. And so that's Saul. And for his part, Samuel delivers precisely what we expect. He essentially repeats what he said before resting in peace. He doesn't bring a fresh word. He draws attention to the previous word. And this is super fascinating, right? It's interesting that Samuel's, a couple things about this. For one thing is that Samuel's first and last prophecies were both announcements of God's judgment on ruling families in Israel. So there's a sense of parallelism here that it turns out that how he began is indeed how he will end. And once more, you also have this recognition that Samuel is essentially saying to Saul, you think you want a new word? You don't need a new word. You just need the same word. And by the way, that word I'd provided for you before is the word that God had judged you and your family. And again, this being a theme in Samuel's ministry shows us that it turns out his mama knew what she was talking about when she sang and praised God for him and talked about those who were on the top being brought down low, those arrogant princes being brought and put in their place. And so we have a lot that's going on here with respect to the narrative of Samuel. I suppose we could probably order our reflections by asking three good questions. And they're pretty natural questions, too, when it comes to this story. The first question that we tend to ask is, what is the meaning and context? And in that sense, I think we've probably covered this. What is the point and purpose and message of this text within the book of 1 Samuel? We see the second to last act of Israel's first king, a man whose life testifies to the consequences of failure to trust and obey. That's the meaning of the story and context. He's gone so far that it actually isn't a surprise that the Lord regretted making him king, because he is actually now breaking the barrier between worshiping God and literal idolatry, turning to those who work with demons. The second question, though, that we ask, at least in our age, probably not in all contexts, but I want to go ahead and raise it, is this a real thing? We can't not wonder. And there's even some debate in the scholarly world that maybe, she didn't expect this to happen, and so she was surprised when she saw Samuel. And I find those a little bit conjectural. For what it's worth, I see no indication in this text that we're talking about something other than an actual event. It seems that the description of this event is precisely what took place. Now, whether it was a one-time thing that God did on this occasion to prove a point, or whether it was a more regular thing that this woman would have experienced, it is at least within the realm of possible reality. Most of the world would probably laugh at us for even wondering, again, for what it's worth. So is this real? Yes, it's real, or so it seems to be. And then there's the takeaway question, the question, again, that we want to always ask, because we're not just reading the Bible so that we can become aware of what happened. We want to ask the question, what do we do with this today? What is the message for us, or what is the significance? How might we be integrated into the claims that this text places on our lives? Should we burn our Harry Potter books, And while we're at it, should we get rid of Star Wars? Should we get rid of Narnia? And again, in my opinion, for what it's worth, I don't think these things are necessary. I don't so much want to address that particular question, because the chances are, no matter what I say, whatever you thought at the beginning of the video is what you're going to think at the end of it. But I do recognize that those are probably valuable questions. But I want to move on to more stable ground in terms of what we know we need to take from this. And I think we see three things to mention real quickly. The first thing is, simply put, stay away from real magic. I think that that's a clear message of this text, and it is supported elsewhere in Scripture. I don't know if you realize this is a real temptation for many people in our world. And increasingly, we're in a context where you'll see claims about things such as crystals and channeling and horoscopes and witchcraft and Wiccan practices and paranormal psychology as being, I'm not joking, as being consistent with faith in Christ. Y'all Google this stuff. Get on Amazon, look up some books about the path of a Christian witch and read the description. It will make your skin crawl, make the hair stand up on your arms to notice that there are many people who are suggesting that it's actually not a competition, that you can actually be a Christian witch, or in the same sense, a Christian wizard who taps into magical practices and yet also maintains your Christian faith. And it seems quite clear from this text and others that this is patently false. If you need more proof, take a look at Acts chapter 8 and notice how the magician fares there. Take a look at Acts chapter 19 and notice what they do with the scrolls when the gospel is preached. And of course, you have this support from 1 Samuel 28. The reality is that Scripture never speaks positively of attempts to contact the beyond, or to find the proper rituals and formula to control spiritual forces, whether through incantation or necromancy in this particular case, and for good reason. Part of the point was, and this was weird, Israel was very strange in the ancient world for not practicing magic, but part of the point was, we have a God who doesn't respond to such things, and he is not afraid of the other forces of evil, and so we need not participate in such things because of who he is. We don't need to do this because he doesn't need help controlling the world, and he has other means of communicating his will to us. And so we note that 1 Samuel seems to contrast David and Saul in that regard. David, when he's in need, seeks out wise voices like Samuel or Jonathan or Abigail. Saul, when he's in need, not so much. And I think part of what's being said here in no uncertain terms is choose your side. It's one or the other. And yet at the same time, we probably need to recognize that whereas that may be a real temptation for some, it is probably not as much for most of us. And so the reality for us is not so much stay away from real magic, but do not confuse magic and faith. Don't blur the line between the two. There are different kinds of idolatry. One kind of idolatry treats something other than God as if it were God. But the more subtle form of idolatry treats God as if he was something other than who he is. It's still idolatry. And again, I'm confident that the majority of us probably aren't going to start sort of worshiping these weird magic rituals. But I am also aware of the fact that probably you, because I know me, I can fall into the trap of treating faith as if it were magic, of treating life with God as if the secret is like finding the right formula to get what it is that I want. And again, we probably never say this, but have you ever prayed about something and then you've been angry at God for not doing what you want? Have you ever thought about how much you attend church and you kind of sometimes don't want to go, but you keep going because you want God to not stop doing good things to you? You want him to bless your endeavors? Have you ever found yourself in a difficult financial situation and you look up at the heavens and you're like, what the heck's going on? Like, I tithe, come on. And in these moments, I think we have to be honest and recognize that what you're seeing here is that it can creep in, man. It can creep in even for us, that we begin to regard our faith as if it's some form of magic. If I just do the right formula, say the right things, and tap into the right sources, then I'm going to get what I want. Y'all, we can make anything into a tool to get what we want. We can do this to the Bible. We can do this to the idea of befriending the unchurched. You can do this by going across the world and becoming a missionary. I mean, I'm serious. Only you can know. Now, this is probably important to say. Only you can know whether your religious efforts are secretly designed to control God, and perhaps even more importantly, even you will have to ask the question more than once to uncover the truth. So take a long look at the way you approach your faith, and especially the way you express yourself when you're disappointed about God not doing what you thought he should do. And you might have to check a bit to see if you've equated the two. So the second message of this text, I think, is not just stay away from real magic, but don't equate magic and faith. And then probably the third thing that we need to say is more positively, turn to the Word. When in need of wisdom, turn to what God has revealed. Saul is presented here in the story as desperate for supernatural insight. And there are times when we find ourselves in the same predicament. I just need a word from God. And if this is you and you are tempted to look toward Endor, hear this well. The knowledge that you seek via the magical arts or the formulaic approach to faith is not the knowledge that you need. That's the message here. In the ancient world, and even today, there are many who practice necromancy, this idea of communicating with the dead. And often the assumption, what they think, like Saul in the story, is that the dead have access to knowledge that we don't have but need, and they may be willing to share. So we find ourselves tempted to consult the cards or the stars or a teller of fortunes because what we think is that God hasn't told me enough as it is. I need a new word. Like, I know I've got this, but it's just not enough. I need more. And I want you to notice, I want you to pay attention to the message that Samuel brings to Saul. He is very clear. And in no uncertain terms, he says, listen, like, all you need to know is what I've already revealed. All you need to know is what the prophets have already communicated. All you need to know is what the word already says. And there's this added bonus. By the way, Saul, whoever speaks to the dead will join them sooner than he thinks. Whoever relies on the words of life, by contrast, will go on living world without end. And we have to acknowledge that our desire for a fresh word from heaven often exposes our refusal to take seriously what God has already revealed. Yeah, this account sets up a contrast for us. It's not just about no magic. It sets up a contrast for us between magic and the prophetic word. The idea of God revealing truth through his appointed mouthpieces. And in the story, they're mutually exclusive. It's either prophecy or magic. Like, you don't get both. Again, you have to choose. It is not enough. It is not enough just to say, oh, we'll stay away from magic, because the question is not just what you're going to avoid, but where you'll go instead. And in wanting a word, and there will come a time when you want a word, we all do. In wanting a word, you're going to turn somewhere. So I suppose it's a fairly simple question, but we need to ask and answer it with care. Will we seek new wisdom from the world? Or will we rely on what God has already made clear? When you need a word, are you going to turn out there? Or are you going to lean in right here?